Imagine a child who, well, doesn't just throw a normal tantrum over a toy, but completely detonates.
Oh, yeah. Like a total meltdown.
Right. We are talking screaming, breaking things, just totally inconsolable. And all because, you asked them to change their shirt before school.
Which is exhausting.
It is. But now imagine that happens like 3 times a week, every single week.
Wow.
And in between those massive explosions, they aren't even returning to a happy baseline. They're just, they're simmering in this constant, dark, walking on eggshells kind of irritability.
Right. The whole house feels it.
Exactly. And for years, the psychiatric community didn't really know what to do with these kids. So they just handed families this terrifying, super heavy diagnosis, pediatric bipolar disorder.
Which is huge. I mean, it was a label that fundamentally altered how a family viewed their child's future.
Yeah, yeah, I can't even imagine.
It dictated incredibly intense medications and carried this lifelong prognosis that, honestly, in many of these cases, simply was not accurate.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at the clinical pivot that kind of changed everything for these families.
It really did.
So for you listening, we are diving into a really interesting stack of sources today. We've got clinical guidelines on a relatively new diagnosis called Disruptive Mood Dysregulation Disorder.
Or DMDD, for sure.
DMDD. And we're also looking at a programmatic overview of a K-12 initiative in Georgia called MentalSpace School. So our mission for this deep dive is to basically untangle this major shift in pediatric mental health and then explore exactly how modern school systems are deploying like frontline interventions to catch these kids before they fall through the cracks.
Yeah, and to really understand the stakes of those frontline interventions, we have to look back at that course correction that happened in the psychological community.
You mean the overdiagnosis issue?
Exactly. Prior to 2013, we were in the middle of this massive overdiagnosis epidemic, essentially.
Because doctors just didn't have the right label.
Right. Doctors were seeing these chronically irritable children with these explosive outbursts, and the only clinical box it seemed to even vaguely fit was bipolar disorder.
But wait, classic bipolar disorder involves, distinct manic episodes and then depressive episodes, right? So a child who is just constantly angry and explosive doesn't really fit that profile at all.
No, they don't. I mean, the fit was entirely off. Bipolar disorder is cyclical. A person experiences a manic high and then crashes into a depressive low.
Right.
And often there are these periods of stability in between. But the kids we were talking about here were persistently severely dysregulated.
There was no cycle to it.
Exactly, no cycle. It was just a constant state of emotional overload. So the psychiatric community finally recognized they were, forcing a square peg into a round hole.
Which is what led to the new DSM-5 publication in 2013.
Yes.
The DSM-5 being, of course, the primary diagnostic manual for psychology.
Right, the rule book.
So they officially carve out this new space and introduce DMDD to stop this misdiagnosis pipeline. But I have to ask.
Sure.
If I am a skeptical parent looking at this, my immediate thought is, aren't we just pathologizing normal bad behavior?
That's a very common reaction.
Right, because kids throw tantrums, kids get irritable. How is this not just, replacing the bipolar overdiagnosis trend with a new trend where we just medicalize a lack of discipline?
Well, the creators of the DSM-5 anticipated that exact skepticism, which is why the diagnostic boundaries for DMDD are incredibly rigid.
How rigid are we talking?
Very. They deliberately designed it so you cannot diagnose a child based on, like, a bad semester or a rough transition to a new school.
Okay.
First off, the severe outbursts and that chronic irritability, they must last for 12 straight months or more.
Oh, wow. So 12 months, that immediately rules out like a temporary reaction to a family divorce or a move.
Exactly, or any stressful life event.
Yeah.
It filters out those environmental stress reactions.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, the onset must occur before the child turns 10 years old.
Yeah.
But, and this is key, the diagnosis can only be given between the ages of 6 and 18.
Wait, why not younger than 6?
Well, we don't diagnose toddlers because severe tantrums are, to an extent, just a normal part of their developmental brain wiring.
Right, the terrible twos and all that. But the sheer scale of the outbursts with DMDD is what fascinates me here. Because the criteria state these tempers are grossly disproportionate to the situation.
Highly disproportionate.
Like, we aren't talking about a kid crying because their bike got stolen.
Well,
we are talking about physical aggression toward people or property just because of, I don't know, a minor change in the daily schedule.
And happening at least 3 times a week.
God, that's intense.
It really is. It paralyzes the entire household. Siblings start hiding in their rooms, parents stop inviting people over.
Yeah, the whole family dynamic just shifts.
But the true core of DMDD, the element that separates it from just a standard behavioral problem, is the baseline mood between the outbursts.
The simmering.
Right. The child is chronically irritable or angry for most of the day, nearly every single day.
I want to try an analogy to visualize that baseline, if that's all right.
Go for it.
So if we think about a typical childhood tantrum, it is kind of like a passing thunderstorm. The sky gets dark, it gets incredibly loud, maybe a tree branch falls down.
Then it blows over.
Exactly. The sun comes out, and the kid is out playing in the puddles 10 minutes later.
Right. The environment resets to a calm state.
But with DMDD, if the baseline mood is always irritable, it isn't a passing thunderstorm. It is more like a permanent, severe climate shift.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you're living in a fundamentally different atmosphere where the barometric pressure is just always low and the storm is like permanently hovering right on the horizon.
That is a great way to put it. A permanent climate shift perfectly captures the systemic nature of the disorder.
Right.
And to prove that it really is a true climate shift and not just a localized storm, the DSM-5 actually requires the symptoms to be present in at least 2 different settings. So home, school, or with peers.
Oh, I see. Which means if a child is destroying their bedroom at home but is perfectly regulated, polite, and attentive at school,
Then that is not DMDD.
because it's localized.
Exactly. That points to a specific dynamic or a trigger in the home environment.
Interesting.
The clinical term is that the dysregulation must be pervasive. It follows the child into every environment because the child's internal nervous system is what's compromised, not just their reaction to a specific authority figure.
Wow. Okay, so with all these strict parameters in place, what are the actual numbers?
Well, current data shows about 2 to 5% of U.S. children actually meet the criteria for DMDD.
2 to 5% sounds like a relatively small slice of the pie, but do the math on a middle school with 1,000 students.
Right.
That is 20 to 50 kids walking the hallways, navigating the severe climate shift every single day.
Yep, every day.
Which honestly makes the diagnostic process sound like a nightmare for clinicians trying to figure out what is actually going on.
Oh, it requires meticulous untangling. Because a chronically irritable child having explosive meltdowns could be dealing with, say, an untreated trauma history.
Right. Trauma can look like anything.
Or they might have an anxiety disorder where a panic attack triggers a violent fight-or-flight response.
Wow, so it looks like anger, but it's fear.
Exactly. Or they could be on the autism spectrum, where sensory overload causes a meltdown that just looks like a temper tantrum to an untrained observer.
Looking through the sources, though, the overlap with ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, that is where the diagnostic puzzle gets incredibly revealing. Because the DSM-5 has this specific rule that kind of feels like a game of poker. If a child meets the criteria for both ODD and DMDD, the diagnosis defaults to DMDD.
Yes.
It essentially acts as a trump card.
And that rule is so important because it fundamentally changes how we view the child's intentions.
How so?
Well, oppositional defiant disorder is categorized primarily as a disruptive behavior disorder. The hallmark there is defiance, arguing with authority, vindictiveness.
So it's very intentional.
Right. So if ODD and DMDD are on a collision course, DMDD wins because it redefines the motive. ODD implies a behavioral choice, like the child is a rebel actively fighting the rules of the house.
But DMDD means the child's internal thermostat is completely broken.
Yes. They aren't trying to be defiant. They are biologically failing to regulate their emotional state.
And if you treat a broken thermostat with a punishment, the way you might discipline a rebel, you actually make the DMDD worse, don't you?
You absolutely do. You spike their dysregulation. So that trump card rule ensures clinicians and parents don't just punish a child for a biological failure. It forces the treatment to focus on the underlying mood regulation.
Man, that biological failure becomes even clearer when we look at the connection to ADHD in the sources.
So the ADHD link is fascinating.
It really is. The clinical guidelines note that ADHD frequently co-occurs with DMDD. But there is this striking clinical revelation when a child has both. Treating the ADHD with stimulant medication often dramatically improves the severe DMDD mood symptoms, which just seems completely counterintuitive to me. You give a highly explosive kid a stimulant and they calm down. How does that even work in the brain?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at what ADHD actually is. It isn't just, an inability to focus on a math worksheet.
Right.
It is a fundamental deficit in executive functioning.
Hmm.
So the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and thinking about consequences, is essentially understimulated.
Like it's asleep.
Exactly. It's asleep at the wheel.
So their brain's braking system never actually engages.
Right. And when that happens in a child with DMDD, a minor frustration like being asked to close a laptop doesn't just cause a pout.
It causes an explosion.
Because the impulse to scream travels from the emotional center of the brain up to the prefrontal cortex. But since the prefrontal cortex is understimulated,
The impulse goes completely unchecked.
the child explodes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So by introducing a stimulant medication, you are providing the dopamine required to wake up that prefrontal cortex.
Yes. You fix the biological brakes.
Wow.
It gives the child that crucial, split second to hit the pause button before the emotion turns into a violent behavior.
It gives them the physiological space to actually use the coping mechanisms they are learning in therapy.
Exactly. And this is why the distinction from bipolar disorder is so critical. You do not treat DMDD with heavy mood stabilizers or antipsychotics as a first line of defense.
Right, because that's not the underlying issue.
The frontline treatments are highly structured and behavioral.
Yeah, the sources outline a few main pillars of this treatment. First is parent management training. And to be clear, this isn't like super nanny coming in to teach discipline.
Yeah.
It is teaching parents how to de-escalate. It's training them to become co-regulators for a child whose nervous system is just constantly misfiring.
The parents basically have to learn how to lower the temperature of the entire house.
Yeah. And then the second pillar is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, for the child.
Yes, focusing specifically on emotional regulation skills.
Right. They learn to identify the physical signs of their anger, like the tight chest, the clenched fists.
And more importantly, what to do when that wave hits.
So if the frontline treatment for DMDD requires carefully managing the child's environment and practicing CBT skills in real time, we kind of run into a massive logistical wall, don't we?
A huge one.
Because kids spend 8 hours a day in a classroom with a teacher who is trying to manage 30 other students.
Right.
How does a clinical treatment plan actually survive contact with a chaotic public school?
Well, historically, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, a 30-minute visit to a clinic once a week just cannot compete with 40 hours of potential triggers in a school building.
That makes total sense.
If the school isn't equipped to handle a dysregulated nervous system, the child will just face suspensions, isolation, and eventual academic failure.
Which is exactly why the K-12 mental health initiative in our source's MentalSpace school in Georgia really caught my attention.
It's a fantastic model.
It is. This is a system specifically designed to embed comprehensive support directly into the educational environment. They aren't just, sending a generic wellness pamphlet to the guidance counselor.
No, they are building out a remarkable infrastructure. MentalSpace provides dedicated therapist teams for every school they partner with.
Wow. Every school.
Every school. So if a student is spiraling into a severe DMDD meltdown, they don't have to wait 3 weeks for an outside appointment.
Right.
MentalSpace offers same-day teletherapy and immediate crisis intervention.
And they really treat the entire ecosystem. The programmatic overview details that they handle suicide and violence prevention, staff wellness, family counseling.
Because if the student is trapped in that permanent climate shift, the teachers and the parents are suffering right alongside them.
Exactly. But I have to throw a massive reality check on this whole thing.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I am a parent or a school administrator listening to this, my immediate thought is that this sounds like a boutique concierge service for very, very wealthy school districts.
Sure.
How does an average family or an underfunded public district actually afford to embed licensed therapists into their hallways?
Well, the financial barrier is usually where these theoretical models completely fall apart, right?
Every single time.
But MentalSpace didn't just build a therapy network. They built a billing infrastructure that completely bypasses the usual bureaucratic nightmares of pediatric mental health care.
Wait, how so? How does that work?
So they fully integrate with Medicaid. They provide these services at zero cost to the families who usually get entirely left behind by the private mental health system.
Zero cost on Medicaid. That is huge.
It is. And for families on commercial insurance, they have integrated with almost every major provider network in the state.
They basically turned mental health care from a luxury good into a utility for these schools.
It's exactly a utility.
Because if a child needs help de-escalating, the insurance logistics aren't going to be the reason they get suspended instead of treated.
Furthermore, they're driving this implementation with a very specific sense of urgency right now.
Oh, because of the legislation.
Yes, Georgia passed state legislation,
Yep.
specifically HB 268,
Right, I saw that in the sources.
and that mandates certain mental health and safety compliances for school districts. So MentalSpace actually serves as this plug-and-play solution to help districts meet that compliance before the strict deadline of July 2026.
But compliance is really just checking a box on a state form.
Sure.
What actually matters are the outcomes. And when you bypass the financial barriers, embed the therapists, and correctly identify biological failures like DMDD rather than just punishing kids for being defiant, the real-world data is pretty staggering.
Oh, the numbers speak for themselves. The sources show an 89% improvement in attendance for the students in this program.
89%. Just think about the mechanics behind that number. Kids who were previously too dysregulated to even walk into the building, kids who were perhaps chronically truant because school was just a constant source of punishment, are now showing up and staying in class.
It's life-changing. And the program also boasts a 92% reduction in anxiety.
Oh.
Because when a child finally feels understood, when the adults in the room recognize they are battling a broken internal thermostat rather than willful disobedience, their baseline anxiety naturally plummets.
Yeah, the fear of an impending explosion is mitigated by the safety net around them.
Exactly.
And then you combine that with an 85% family satisfaction rate, parents are finally feeling like they have an active partner in the school system.
Right, rather than fighting a solitary, exhausting battle against that climate shift at home alone.
It really is a powerful testament to what happens when clinical clarity, like the creation of the DMDD diagnosis back in 2013, finally meets a practical, accessible infrastructure on the ground today.
It connects the theory to the real world.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We have mapped out quite a journey today.
We really have.
We looked at how the psychological community recognized their own massive blind spot, pivoting away from the heavy burden of pediatric bipolar overdiagnosis by defining DMDD in 2013. We explored the rigid boundaries that separate a bad mood from a dysregulated nervous system, how DMDD changes our understanding of oppositional behavior, and how treating co-occurring ADHD actually fixes the biological breaks.
And then we bridge that clinical theory into the real world. Exploring how systemic programs like MentalSpace School bypass traditional financial barriers to change the trajectory of students' lives directly in the classroom.
The ultimate takeaway here, whether you are raising kids, teaching them, or just participating in society alongside them, is a shift in empathy.
A huge shift.
When we understand the profound difference between a passing behavioral thunderstorm and a permanent, severe climate shift, we change our entire approach.
We really do.
We stop looking at an explosive child and asking, what is wrong with you? And we finally start asking, how can we support you?
Yes. We move from a framework of punishment to a framework of skill building.
Exactly.
But, knowledge is only powerful when we apply it. Advocating for the right systemic support, whether that is pushing for an accurate diagnosis or supporting integrated school programs, is how we put this into practice.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up this deep dive, though, there is one final thought I want to leave you with, and it builds on that historical pivot we discussed.
Okay.
We know today that if a child gets the proper diagnosis and immediate embedded support at school, it can radically alter the course of their life. I mean, we see it in that 89% jump in attendance.
It is the difference between thriving and falling entirely through the cracks.
But consider the timeline for a second. The medical community didn't even have the language for DMDD until 2013.
Right.
So what happened to the generations of kids in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s? What happened to the kids who were trapped in that permanent, severe climate shift before the DSM-5 was updated?
It's hard to think about.
Their severe struggles were likely just mislabeled as bad behavior, or they were heavily medicated for a bipolar disorder they didn't even have, or they were just completely pushed out of the educational system because nobody knew how to fix their biological breaks.
It is a staggering generational blind spot.
Yeah.
I mean, how many life trajectories could have been saved if the map we have today existed 30 years ago?
It really makes you deeply appreciate the clinical clarity we are finally beginning to achieve.
Absolutely.
So the next time you see a child caught in the middle of a massive, disproportionate storm, you might just look past the behavior and see the broken thermostat underneath. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.